In this section, we want to talk about IaaS providers and their global infrastructure. In other words, how do they offer the level of service, the number of services that they offer using distributed global data centers, and then how they name those data centers, how they name those geographic regions, and how we can leverage multiple data centers for our applications. The first thing we need to understand is the concept of regions. Regions, like the names suggest, is a geographic region that each IaaS provider defines for itself. In other words, one IaaS provider might name US East. They might create multiple data centers in US East region, and they might call that region as US East. Some other provider might be using the US West or US Central or European Union, and so on and so forth. So these geographic regions are very important for us because when we decide to set up our service or application in cloud, we want to make sure which region is suitable for our application. Where are our users coming from? Are they specifically coming from a country, or they are restricted to a geographic state or country or continent, or they're global? So when we design our application, we want to understand the concept of region. In addition to the region, we want to understand zones. Zones are nothing but specific data centers or the different data centers within each geographic region. So the same IaaS provider we talked about, which created a US East region, they might create 2 or more zones within that region, or 2 or more data centers within the same region. And they would name these regions and zones which are convenient, which are standard with the IaaS provider. So we have to understand the concept of regions and zones when we start using these cloud providers or IaaS providers. In addition to regions and zones, we also need to understand the concept of edge locations. Edge locations are smaller data centers, smaller footprints these IaaS providers rent across different data centers from other countries' data centers. In other words, edge locations are designed to take us close to the users. So we can offer some services that are closer to the user. Important concept about edge locations is we cannot start a server in edge location. We cannot use it directly. The cloud providers or the IaaS providers they use those edge locations to offer some specialized services like content delivery network or a DNS service. And we as cloud consumers will then use those services instead of setting up our own servers in these edge locations. In addition to the edge location services, we also want to understand some of the other services that these IaaS providers offer. We're going to look at 3 primary IaaS providers. The first one being Amazon Web Services or AWS, the second being GCP or Google Cloud Platform, and finally Microsoft Azure. Amazon Web Services can be found at aws.amazon.com. Google Cloud Platform or GCP as they are known, their homepage is cloud.google.com. And finally, Microsoft Azure can be found at azure.microsoft.com. In the previous section, we already created an account for us in a public cloud such as AWS. We used our personal information such as our name, email address, phone number, provided a valid credit card to create an account for us in a public cloud. We're going to use that account throughout the course, but we just want to mention here that all we need to get an account on a public cloud is those 2 pieces of information, our personal information and a credit card. The IaaS providers essentially create multiple data centers spread across the globe, and they design the data centers so that they have the best availability possible. We can expect over 4 nines of availability from those data centers. And in addition to the concept of availability, they also provide us redundant data centers so that we can distribute our applications in multiple data center. In case something happens to one data center, our applications should still be able to continue functioning because we have a copy of the application in another data center. It could be nearby or it could be in a separate region. Typically, it's a different zone. So we'll talk about how to install our application, how to deploy our applications as we go along. But cloud providers provide these functions or these features so that we are not restricted to a single data center within a region. So region again is a geographic region that is specific to an IaaS provider. In other words, Amazon might call their region US East because all their group of data centers are located in Northern Virginia. They might create multiple data centers in US West. In fact, they do. They have a US West 1 and US West 2 because there are two different regions they used on the West Coast. And they name those regions based on the continent, country, and the direction or state, whatever. So it's, in other words, Amazon might use this terminology, Google might use a slightly different terminology, but the concepts are all same. Zones, on the other hand, are the individual physical data centers within a specific region. The zones are where we're going to use our servers and services. This is where we're going to directly install our application. This is where we're going to use those virtual machines that we talked about. And each zone within a region is connected using high bandwidth, low latency network so that the data transfer is much faster. The data transfer is much more efficient between these two, between multiple zones within the same region. And they're named based on simple naming convention. So in this case, we have region US East 1 because that's the first region in US East. And then within that region, we have multiple availability zones such as A, B, and C. So in Amazon's case, they call the regions simply as regions, but instead of zones, they call it availability zones. Okay. So in this diagram, we have two regions, US East, which is located in Northern Virginia, and there's a EU West, which is located in Ireland. And within each regions, there are two or more zones, so we can use them to start our applications, our services. Okay. So in this case, I have US East 1A through 1D, and in EU West, we have 1A to 1C. Okay. So this is what Amazon chooses to name their regions and availability zones. Okay. This is another diagram. This is provided by Amazon. If you look at this diagram, they have it's documented in such a way that there are multiple availability zones, but the blue lines that you see between those availability zones is that high-speed, low-latency network we talked about. So in this diagram, you see US West Coast, you see region Australia, and EU Ireland with multiple availability zones between each of them. Google, on the other hand, they call regions as regions and zones as zones, and then they have very, very similar naming convention. So in this case, instead of US East or West, Google has a US Central, and within US Central, they have 1B, 1C, 1D, and so on and so forth. And in Western Europe, they have Europe West 1B, 1C, 1D. Okay. So as you can see, both Google and Amazon follow very similar naming convention. Azure, on the other hand, has a slightly different model. So instead of calling them regions and availability zone, they kind of collapsed and they just called it regions. Okay. So again, it's slightly different nomenclature, slightly different naming convention, but we know when we talk about regions and zones, We know that some cloud providers might have regions and zones, and some of them might just have a region in their infrastructure. But the concepts are same. So why do you need multiple availability zones? If you want to deploy a fault-tolerant applications, if you want to make sure your application never goes down, it is highly available all the time. We want to deploy those applications at least across multiple zones in a single region. So that what that means is if we have a 4-node application, we want to install 2 nodes in the first AZ or first availability zone, and the 2 remaining nodes into a second or a different availability zone. So the idea is if something happens to one of the zones, our application is still able to respond using those 2 nodes that are in the other availability zone. The availability zones are designed so that they are at least 5 to 10 miles away from each other, and each availability zone gets its own power, it gets its own network, it has its own ISP. So in case something happens to one of the ISPs or the power when goes out in one availability zone, doesn't mean the second availability zone is also impacted. And that's the reason we can create fault-tolerant applications, because we have deployed our application in multiple zones. Okay. So it helps us protect against unexpected failure of components. Your disk fails, or a server crashes, or something happens to your data center, to our availability zone, or the rack your server is on loses power or whatever. Your application will still be able to function because we deployed that application in multiple availability zones, multiple data centers. And all the cloud providers offer all these services for us. Okay. So what are some of the other services that the IaaS providers offer? In addition to, we talked about compute service, we talked about database service, storage service briefly in the previous section. In addition to those, they might offer analytics service, they might offer networking service, they might offer content delivery network service that we talked about, right? They might offer media encoding service, they might offer a NoSQL service. So there are literally tens of services your cloud provider might offer. Okay. All those services are offered in those regions and availability zones. Okay. One thing that we may want to note is not all services are offered in all regions. Okay. So typically most of these IaaS provider do a rolling launch. So what that means is when a new service or a new feature is introduced, Amazon, for instance, will deploy it on US East region. And that means the other regions, they have to catch up with Amazon East. And it could be months or even a year before the other regions catch up to the services they offer in US East. Okay. That doesn't mean that you always want to go in US East, because there are some other requirements you have to keep in mind. But this is just to show that not all services are offered by the same provider in all regions. Okay. If you want to understand the way Amazon builds their regions and availability zone, there's a URL at the bottom of the screen you can check out. So in this case, this page, there's a URL at the bottom. You might see different services listed for different regions that Amazon has. So in this case, as you can see, there's a service called AppStream, which is offered only in Northern Virginia as of this recording. Another service is the Cognito. Similar thing, they offer only in Northern Virginia. Okay. The Amazon Glacier service, for instance, is not offered in the Sao Paulo regions. So that's a key point we want to remember. This is Google's service catalog. As you can see, in the central US, they have different types of servers, they have different processors they use, and in Western Europe, they might be slightly different type of services, and East Asia might offer different types of services. This is just the hardware specifications they have in each of these regions. And some of the IaaS providers like Google, they actually tell you the city where that data center is located. And sometimes they may not tell you the exact city, but they'll tell you the general geographic region. And to understand Google's zones and where they're located, where their services are located, you could check out that URL at the bottom of the screen. Microsoft Azure has different levels of services. They have several different types of virtual machines. They have some cloud services. Again, as you can see, not all services are offered at all regions. So this is typical pattern by most of these IaaS providers. And it doesn't mean that the service will not come to those regions. It just means that they're still testing it. Locations are special data centers or smaller data centers the cloud providers rent to offer a couple of specialized services. And some of the services that we already mentioned are the content delivery networks. And as I said earlier, the edge locations are for the use of the IaaS providers themselves. In other words, they won't let us create our own instances, our own applications in these edge locations. Okay. So they use those edge locations to offer a service such as CDN service, such as DNS service. We then can turn around and use those services. Okay. So we are going to use the edge locations indirectly, not directly. So the edge locations for Amazon is listed here. So as you can see, as of this recording, they have 50 plus edge locations, and the number in parentheses are the number of edge locations in each site. So how do you choose a region? Choose a region that makes sense for your application. Okay. Are your users in a specific geographic location? Are they all in US? Then you may want to choose something that's in US, obviously. And what kind of pricing factors you may have to take into account, right? Sometimes the price in US East may be higher compared to US West because there's a lot of demand for services in US East. Okay. Similarly, if you want to start a service in Australia, the price in Australian region may be higher because Amazon is paying higher price for those services in those countries. So again, it depends on the pricing factor, the level of services that they offer you. As we said, not all services are offered in all regions. So you may want to do some due diligence. You have to figure out, okay, which location or which region meets all your requirements. So in summary, we said geographic regions are geographic areas that are defined by the cloud provider. Okay. And there are three providers we talked about: AWS, Google, and Azure. Within each region, there are multiple data centers, and we call them, or they call it, zones or availability zones. Okay. There are at least 2 availability zones per region. Okay. And we also learn what edge locations are and how the IaaS providers use those edge locations to offer specialized services like content delivery network, CDN, and DNS. We learned about the services and prices may vary by regions, okay, because each service is deployed initially in the primary region and then rolled out to other regions as and when the testing is done, or as and when the features become available, then you can start using those services. So when you're designing a new application, we need to make sure that the region that you are thinking about meets all your requirements. So the primary requirement that you want to make sure are met is based on your user pattern. Okay, where are your users coming from? Where are the maximum number of users coming from? If it's a geographically distributed user base, then it makes sense to deploy, use at least more than one region in that case. So you may want to use one region in US East, one region in Europe, one region in Australia, and so on, depending on the footprint of your application. You know the applications much better than anybody, so it's you have to choose a region or regions that meet your use case.